Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about humane conditions and what that means. So my wife thought we were going to talk about the conditions in the detention camps down on the southern border with Mexico, detaining immigrants coming in. That's not actually quite what I had in mind. What I was talking about or thinking about in terms of humane conditions was an extension of last week in if we're speaking for humanity, what conditions do we actually need as humans to survive? But as I thought about it more, I thought that the detention facility story is actually a great analogy for this conversation. If we're going to identify positively what things we need to survive and thrive, we should kind of look at where we are today. And I think the detention camp, unfortunately, is a fairly good parallel. So we have humans who are being detained in facilities that I think arguably most of us would agree are not satisfactory. So they don't have enough supplies, they're at risk for disease, they're dirty, they can't clean themselves, they don't have enough nutrition, and that is like a mini version of the world that we're creating for ourselves today, where we live in a world of scarcity, maybe not us so much in the West, but around the world we live in a world of scarcity. We live in a world where disease is still rampant, where people don't have enough supplies for themselves in terms of food and water and whatever else. And so, and it's dirty, the world is dirty, and it gets dirtier as we fail to address the environmental concerns. So I think it's an interesting concept to keep in mind as we go through some ideas about what is it we actually need as humans. And so again, this goes back to the idea from last week of who speaks for humanity, and last week we'd said not the government, or I'd said not the government. Right? The government is interested in concerns of power. That's what the government does. And so in this case, we might argue, I think I would personally, that the government has not applied its diffusion of power well in caring for humans. Now granted, some people would argue, well, these aren't our humans, right? These belong to some other tribe or group or government who's responsible for them. I think that's kind of a short-sighted view because we're all humans, we're all on this planet together. So I think it's important to remember that we end up speaking for humanity as individuals and then collectively as groups. So we need to figure out what it is we're speaking for. Going back probably to the fall, we actually had a conversation about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? So traditionally, you have war, death, pestilence, and famine. And if you've seen the show Good Omens recently, which is a show currently, I think it's on Amazon, that some people are very upset about. It's a really interesting show that looks at what would some of the traditional biblical end of the world look like if applied to modern day society. And so they actually changed pestilence to pollution in terms of the four horsemen. And I thought that was really interesting because what we had identified in the fall was basically disease, so that's still pestilence, war, and particularly nuclear war, which no spoilers in the show, or a little bit of spoilers in the show, that's what they're trying to bring about. And then climate is what I had actually identified is the risk to climate. So that includes famine, pollution, the biodiversity collapse, and then death. The way we had identified it was threats, existential threats to humanity, so particularly space-based threats. And we talked about the redundancy, the need to move humans off of the singular planet, the singular speck of dust in all of the universe. So I want to identify those things as those are the negatives, right? That's what we're trying to avoid, but that doesn't yet give us the positive. It doesn't yet give us a vision of what it could look like if we can craft the kind of a future where humans are surviving and thriving. So there are a couple of interesting ideas I think we need to address first. The first is the idea of scarcity, right? There are places in the world where there are not enough resources, particularly when you look at specific geographies in specific times and distances, right? So in the middle of the Sahara, there isn't a lot of water. But when you look at the resources available on the entire planet, there's more than enough food to feed people, there's more than enough water to provide for people, there's more than enough resources to get people to at least their basic needs. However, our system is not currently designed to provide for those. Now, what I'm talking about here is not a new idea of communism or socialism where everybody has exactly the same, but more where everyone has enough. The reason that idea is important is, as humans, it's very difficult for us to contribute in meaningful ways if we cannot reach our basic needs. Right? As we'd spoken about a couple of times before, the people who really advanced science, particularly in the Renaissance era, were people who were part of the aristocracy. They were usually children of aristocratic families that had enough resources that they could sort of let their minds wander. Think about things. Why does the apple fall? Right? Why do the stars move on certain paths? But if you were out toiling in the fields just trying to feed yourselves and your family, then you didn't think about those things too much. You had other things to worry about. So how can we get people's basic needs met so that they can actually have the time to think? How much power would we unlock if people had those basic needs met? If we weren't all working 40 and 50 and 60 and 80 and 100-hour weeks? If we weren't scraping by on 3 jobs to get enough food to feed ourselves and our children? What if our system were a little bit different? And I think a different system, whatever it would happen to look like, is predicated on the idea of getting past scarcity. So post-scarcity mindset. So what might that look like? Well, some people talk about the universal basic income. Some might be just reducing consumption, where we don't need the big house with all the stuff to fit all the stuff that we need in the big house, right? Those are different ideas. They might be possible. They might not. There might be some administrative issue with those things. However, they are concepts that get us to a new future. They allow us to imagine something different than today. So keep that idea of post-scarcity in mind as we go forward. The other piece that we talked about before is a human economy. So right now we have a very industrialized economy, right? Where things are produced far away. They are very efficient, but there also is not a lot of redundancy built into that system. So when we see things like catastrophic floods or big storms, when we have trade disputes, the systems start to break down because they're based on this idea of interoperability and interconnection around the world, a global supply chain. For some things that's necessary, right, because the resources on the planet are distributed. But for other things, they're not necessary, but they have been this idea of global supply chain has been reinforced because it allows companies to gain profit, right? That's why we had discussed last week that companies don't speak for humanity because they're primarily concerned on short-term profit. So instead of this global economy, and I don't mean in terms of protectionism and we don't share our resources, we don't specialize as maybe even countries, but in terms of things like the basic needs, food, shelter, power, those things can easily be produced at the local level, but they've not been for a long time. So what would happen if the system did happen to break down? You'd have a lot of people starve to death, is what would happen. So how could we reimagine the economy, reimagine society to be more human scale, where maybe more food is produced locally and people actually know where it comes from and know how to grow it? And that's not just a nice thing that we pay extra money for the organic food or the whatever, but that we actually have the skills to provide for ourselves in the case of catastrophe, right? That, again, gets us a little bit of that human redundancy in terms of the way the system operates so that we can provide for ourselves so humanity can continue. So, with those ideas in mind, what are the humane conditions? So I think the first one is abundant energy. Energy is the thing that allows us to maintain the complexity we have today. As we talked about when we discussed chaos and complexity, humans require complexity to exist. Our planet is an amazingly complex system, unique as far as we know in the universe that we have so far explored, and requires a very narrow set of conditions for us to be able to exist. So that's fairly complex. There are a lot of different levels that have built up to the point where we can exist in this time and space. Now our society is even more complex. We've built up over thousands of years now to have certain operating conditions. Society is complex enough that no one person truly understands it, so we need to maintain a level of complexity. That requires a lot of energy. because the opposite of complexity is chaos, also known as entropy. And if you know anything about physics, a system requires energy to maintain complexity and to get away from entropy. So we have to have abundant energy. Now, when we connect this to the environment, ideally that's clean energy. So I was doing a little bit of research and found the estimate to transition the US to a completely renewable energy system. That's including the actual power production, the grid, the storage, is somewhere between $4 and $5.7 trillion. That's a lot of money, right? It's, I forget what our debt is at right now. It's over $1 trillion for sure. What's that? The debt, 20 trillion? So it's a lot. So we have a lot of debt. So, and in terms of our GDP, that's a fair chunk for probably a good number of years. But is it worth it for the investment? Well, environment is the thing that we require to exist, so I kind of think it is. And it should be something that we aspire to, as opposed to figure out how do we not get there, right? How do we maintain the status quo? Another question surrounding abundant energy is not just with our country, but should we then share and should we provide for countries that are not yet industrialized? Again, when you go to the environment question, if they're going to run through the same fossil fuel burning process that we did, we're going to be dead far before we ever get to take advantage of our renewable energy system, right, due to climate change. So the first one is abundant energy. The second one, of course, is that environment. And if you look at what that actually means, it's a stable, temperate environment. That's fairly specific when you look at the way the world operates. Just last week, we saw huge heat waves throughout Europe, which were created by a disruption in the jet stream, theorized due to the melting and the disruption in the Arctic, right? So we require, again, a very narrow band of circumstances that can be easily tipped one way or the other. So what does that mean? Well, we get our food, water, and shelter from the environment, right? A lot of those things are much more difficult to produce when we don't have the right conditions to grow, particularly today, the industrialized food, and to have the distribution, to have adequate fresh water. And then even in terms of shelter, many of the resources we draw from, particularly wood, are again dependent on the environmental conditions. So that means we should probably work to minimize pollution, and that's both in terms of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases warming up the environment, but then also the actual pollution. This used to be a very nonpartisan thing, right? When you looked at the smog in LA in the 70s, and you looked at pollution in the rivers in the US and elsewhere around the world, and acid rain in Europe, this was not at all controversial. Everyone was like, I prefer not to get burned from acid rain, or not to have polluted water, or not to breathe in poisoned air. And yet today it's a partisan issue, and that to me is a very surprising thing. It seems that it would be an easy answer that we all want to have clean water and fresh air and resources available. So at this point in the world's progress, we have to come to grips with a very difficult question. We have a lot of people on the planet. I probably think it's not a good idea to pick and choose which ones get to stay and which ones have to go. So I think it's then important to realize that we have to come to grips with managing our environment. And I mean that in a very active sense. That instead of just wishing things would get better, or even taking the tiny steps, we might actually have to grapple with the idea that we have to geoengineer our own planet. And I don't mean that in terms of playing God, if you will, or tinkering with things that we don't fully understand. I mean that we should work to fully understand the systems, how they interoperate, and how we can best manage our resources that are limited on this planet to continue our existence. So should we go around just frivolously blowing up volcanoes and shooting, silver ions into the air so that it'll rain in certain places? No, I think we should probably study it a bit. But it's getting to the point where we do need to do something. And so I think that's an important condition to actually start to look at and say, this might be a real thing that we have to do. And there's a lot of philosophy that goes on behind that. Who's in charge? Who's affected? How do we make it happen? But I think it will be a reality. So 1 was abundant energy. 2 is stable, temperate environment. 3 is community, society, and government. I think particularly in the West, we have become decadent and not appreciative of the systems that we have. And I don't mean this for any particular country, but the West in general. So something we've talked about previously is that comfort prevents growth. When you're comfortable, you are not required to come face to face with the challenges of life. And it also makes it so that you don't appreciate the things that you have. Right? When it comes to things like happiness, there's some good studies, and when you buy a new car, you're very excited about your new car. You love all the features of the car, and it's so amazing. And then a couple weeks go by, and you don't notice them anymore. Right? So there's a numbing effect to having more, to having something better, shinier, etc. The same thing is true with our government and our system that we have. Now, is it a perfect system? No. By definition, no system is perfect. It's optimized for whatever conditions you set for it. But compared to some alternatives, I think it's fairly good, particularly if the people who are supposed to run it, which is us as the voter, stay engaged. So I think it's important for us to remember that we as humans, as social creatures, require community, require society, and because of the number of us and the complexity in dealing with each other, we require government. But it's our responsibility to manage that. In managing that government, it's got to be stable. We've got to provide for trust in others, right? That's what government is about. It's a system of rules that we can operate on a daily basis without thinking people are going to steal from us, kill us, etc. And then it provides general safety. Government, because it's sort of the spokesperson or the agent of the people at large, also directs a lot of investment. Now, I'm not talking about investment in money, I'm talking about investment in human capital, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of large-scale projects, right? But it's all about developing the human. So whether that's effective educational systems, which I think we could argue aren't super effective today, whether it's conditions that provide for a healthy environment, whether it's conditions that provide for people to be able to take care of themselves, those are the things that government, at the direction of the people, should be providing. Another thing that government, and not just government, but also the society and the community that we create through our interactions with each other, are things like inclusion, a sense of purpose, general human unity, this idea that, hey, we're all stuck here on this planet, at least for now, let's work together to make the best of it. And then again, it's that diffusion of power that's the thing that actually holds the government accountable. And so we should require our governments not only to keep the power diffuse, but also to be adaptive. Because any system that cannot change will eventually become obsolete. Anyone who thinks otherwise tends to get left behind in history. And those in power tend to cling to their power and tend to reinforce the system that they find advantageous. And they often fail to see that they're being outmoded, or that they're creating the response against them that's going to bring that system down. So far in history, there are some systems that have lasted a long time, many of them longer than the systems that exist today. And so this idea that our system today, as it was originally designed, will last forever, I think is a bit naive. Any system that exists should have built in the ability to adapt. That's called evolution, and evolution is the thing that keeps you, keeps your existence going, continues your meaning forward. So the third was community, society, and government. The fourth is education. And this is this very personal human investment. As we talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, it's interesting to conceptualize humanity as a superorganism, as one body comprised of many individual pieces, much like our body is comprised of cells. But each of those cells needs to be trained and specialized to do something on behalf of the body. Humans are much the same way, more independent in their operation, but still dependent on the whole to exist. So how do we train ourselves to then best contribute to the whole of the body? Well, that's primarily education. So what is it that we need for our education? Well, so one, we build on human history and achievement. We need to build the systems that allow us to aggregate and use everything that we've learned thus far. Our phones are actually a pretty great example of that. We have access, if used well, to all of human history and achievement. To try and maximize human potential, and that's a very kind of vague idea, but what that might look like is we consider each individual a fully functioning being capable of greatness. People are going to achieve different levels of greatness, and how you would even define greatness is up for grabs. But assuming that everyone is able to contribute, I think is a powerful idea. And we stop looking at people as detractors. Instead, we start looking at people as someone with a different opinion who provide diversity. And as we've also discussed before, diversity is key to survival. Somebody might have the one different idea that's going to allow us to survive, that's going to take us on that correct branch that avoids catastrophe. And we need to cherish that. And then the idea with education is, as we bring it together, as we develop our ideas, that we're preventing both previous catastrophes, such as war, and future catastrophes, ones that we've not yet encountered. Again, something maybe like a space-based threat. And then to maximize our understanding of existence and develop an ability to predict, or at least imagine, what futures could be like. We had a good conversation the other day at a different philosophy forum this week about what does it mean to be human? What responsibility do we have as individuals? And the question was, well, it sounds like you're arguing that we must try and understand everything. And I said, yes, that's exactly it. Each of us individually should, I would say must, do our very best to understand the conditions in which we exist. That means understanding as much of humanity, our systems, our requirements as possible. Now, can one person know everything? Absolutely not. Until we augment our brain with supercomputers or quantum computers, I think that would be very difficult. But even then, in the process of implanting those things, we would create a complexity greater than ourselves, most likely. So we have to rely on each other. We have to build systems where we support each other in that understanding and work to maximize it. The last thing we need is redundancy. It's really easy, because we only live 80 or so years, to look at our time scale and say, oh, the Earth will be here for billions of years. That's practically forever. And yes, in your mind, it might be practically forever, but it's not forever. So in expanding our understanding, we also have to expand it outside of our time horizon. We have to look at what happens when the Earth dies, what happens when the sun dies, what happens when our solar system dies. Do we wish to continue our existence? I'd argue for yes. I've kind of enjoyed mine so far. I think others enjoy theirs generally. So I think it's kind of a good thing, and I think the humanist perspective is that it is good to continue humanity's existence. That means we have to come to grips with the fact that there are universal forces out there that we don't yet control, or that we may never control and we simply have to avoid or take advantage of. So getting off this planet, to me, should be the unifying thing that brings together humanity. And we saw this for a period of time with the International Space Station being a joint space station. And I would bet that the people on that space station look back at the Earth and find silly some of the conflicts that we get ourselves in. Because you think about the space station and the trials and the struggles that we went through in getting through spaces, people realize when they're up there that you are all alone and you have to rely on each other, and that life is fragile and any one thing could go wrong and wipe it out in an instant. The Earth is nothing more than a really big spaceship. And I don't mean that literally, it's metaphorically. I don't think we're actually on a spaceship. I don't want to start like a new, conspiracy or Scientology-based religion. Area 54. Yeah, Area 54, right? Pick the next number. But if you look at it like that, if you can zoom your perspective out, you realize that we are all stuck here. There is no escape hatch, there is no spacesuit, and there are no thrusters on this particular spaceship. We're just kind of floating out here. So we're going to be here until our oxygen runs out, which we're working at, ruining our environment inside of our spaceship right now. And that's not a good thing. So we need to really start looking at that. So the questions I'm going to leave you with today are this. Do we want to set the conditions of our children's existence to that of a detention facility, where it's dirty and insufficient and not providing for maximizing their potential? Or do we want to create a future where we survive and thrive? And so as we discussed last week about speaking for humanity, and the choice and the responsibility to speak for humanity is ours. Thanks very much.